The courthouse in Miles City smelled of pine resin and old paper, and the particular kind of cold that seeps into wood walls and never fully leaves no matter how many fires are built against it. Marshal George Tanner had seen a lot of women come through that door over 15 years behind his desk. Women who were frightened, women who were angry, women who had come to report something or deny something or beg for something. He had not seen many women who came in the way this one did. She was broad-shouldered and steady-footed, and she carried a small worn notebook pressed flat against her ribs like it was the most natural thing in the world to hold. She was not young, but she was not soft either. Not in the way that fear makes people soft. She sat down in the chair across from him without being asked. She placed the notebook on the table between them. She looked at him directly the way people look at you when they have already decided they are not going to apologize for being in the room. He asked her name. Ruth Byler Duff, she said. Wife of Silas Duff. He asked her what she had. She said, I have kept these pages for 11 years, Marshal. I did not know they were important when I wrote them. I know now. She slid the notebook across the table. He opened it. He read. He stopped at one page and read it again. Then he looked up at her and he said, You wrote these things when you were 19 years old. Yes, sir. You wrote them the same day they happened. The same evening, she said. I wrote down what I did not understand. I have always done that. I thought one day I might understand it. I was right. Tanner looked at the page again. He looked at her hands, which were resting flat on the table, completely still. Not the hands of a woman performing calm. The hands of a woman who had spent a long time learning the difference between being afraid and letting fear show. He set the notebook down carefully, the way you set something down when you are not sure yet what it is worth. But you have begun to suspect it might be worth quite a lot. He said, If you testify to this, Mrs. Duff Dean Proctor will not stop with your husband's land. She said, He never started there. I only took too long to understand that. Tanner leaned back in his chair. The fire in the corner of the room popped once and settled. Outside, through the single window, the first pale signs of Montana spring were pressing up through the gray, reluctant and slow, the way things that have survived a hard winter always are. He said, Let me hear it from the beginning. She folded her hands. She began. 3 months earlier. The meeting house of the old German Baptist congregation at Harlan's Crossing, Montana Territory had been built to last. The walls were thick timber, the floor unfinished pine, the windows small and deep set against the cold. There was no decoration. There was no color. There was only the plain, deliberate utility of people who had decided that beauty was a distraction from what mattered, and what mattered was the work and the prayer and the community that made both possible. Ruth Byler had spent 30 years of Sunday mornings in this room. She had been carried into it as an infant. She had learned to read in its adjoining schoolroom. She had watched her father and then her mother be carried out of it in pine boxes covered with plain white cloth and laid in the frozen ground behind the south wall, where the markers were stone and the inscriptions were short because the dead did not need flattery. She knew every board in the floor. She knew which ones creaked and which ones held. She knew the smell of the room in summer and in winter, and on the particular mornings after a heavy snow, when the cold pressed through even the thick walls, and you could see your breath in the air when you sang the morning hymn. She knew all of this, and standing in the center of the room on a December morning in 1888, she understood for the first time that knowing a place was not the same as belonging to it. The 5 elders sat in a row behind the long table at the front of the room. She had known all 5 of them since childhood. Brother Hartman, who had given her hard candy at Christmas when she was small. Brother Weiss, who had taught her father to mend harnesses. Brother Lapp, whose wife had sat with her mother through the last illness and held her hand at the end. Brother Schlabach, who was Nora's father-in-law, and who Ruth had always quietly liked because he laughed easily and without apology. And Elder Amos Byler, her mother's brother. The man who had taught her to plant by the moon and to judge weather by the color of the western sky, and to always, always write down the things she did not understand, Because the mind forgets, but paper remembers. Amos sat at the center of the row. His hands were folded on the table before him. He was 60 years old, and he had always looked younger than his age, but he did not look younger today. He looked like a man who had not slept well in a long time and had stopped expecting to. Sister Ruth Brother Hartman said. He had a kind voice. He had always had a kind voice. Ruth had learned over the years that a kind voice and a kind heart were not the same instrument. We have prayed on this matter for many months. We have sought guidance. We have come to a decision. She said nothing. She had known the decision before she walked through the door. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, because the light changes, because the air changes, because the birds go quiet in a way that is different from ordinary quiet. You are 30 years of age, Brother Hartman continued. You have not married. You have not contributed to the growth of the congregation in the ways that the Lord intends for women of this community. The land you farm was your father's land, and without a husband to work it properly, without children to inherit it, it has become a burden that the community has carried longer than is just. She listened. She had heard the words in fragments over the years, in the edges of conversations that stopped when she walked past, in the silences between sentences that were spoken to her with too much careful gentleness. She had heard them enough times that they had lost their particular sting. What remained was something harder and quieter, something that did not hurt the way pain hurts, but sat in the chest like a stone sits at the bottom of a clear river. Always there, always heavy, but at least visible, at least known. It is our decision, Brother Hartman said, that you have 15 days to make arrangements for your future. If a husband comes forward within that time, the matter is resolved. If not, the congregation will assist you in relocating to the mission settlement at Billings, where your skills as a teacher may find better application. Ruth looked at each man in turn. Hartman, who could not quite meet her eyes. Weiss, who had his hands flat on the table and was studying them. Lapp, who looked at the window. Schlabach, who looked at a point somewhere above her head. And then Amos, who looked directly at her. She said, 5 votes, Uncle Amos. 5 elders. Who was the 5th? The room was very quiet. Amos said nothing. His hands on the table did not move. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted the way ice shifts before it breaks, the way the ground shifts before the frost comes up through it in spring. Something moved and then went still, and the stillness was worse than the movement had been. His silence was the answer. She said, I have plowed that land since I was 12 years old. I have planted it, and I have harvested it, and I have kept the books that my father kept before me. And I have never once asked the congregation to carry anything that I could carry myself. If that is a burden, then I do not know what the word means. No one replied. There is a particular kind of silence that is not the absence of speech, but the active, deliberate withholding of it. This was that kind of silence. It pressed against her from all 5 directions, and she stood in the center of it and let it press and did not move. 15 days, Sister Ruth, Brother Hartman said again. Go in peace. She turned and walked toward the door, and she did not look back. Not because she was afraid to, but because there was nothing behind her now that deserved the effort. Outside, the December air hit her like a flat hand. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and featureless, the kind of sky that made the world below it feel smaller than it was. Snow had fallen in the night and not yet been walked through, so the path from the meeting house door lay white and unbroken in both directions. Her footprints were the first ones in it. She stood on the step for a moment. Just a moment. Then she walked. She walked past the barns and past the well and past the schoolhouse where she had spent 8 years teaching children to read and cipher and understand the world through the narrow, careful window that the community permitted. She walked past the house where she had been born and where she had lived alone for the 6 years since her mother's death, the house with the south-facing garden where she grew the herbs her mother had grown, and the apple tree her father had planted the year before she was born, which was thick and gnarled now and bore fruit every September without fail. She stopped at the edge of the property where the land gave way to the rough scrub and the fence line ran. She stood there. The cold worked through her wool dress and her shawl and settled against her skin, and she let it because the cold, at least, was honest about what it was. Behind her, the meeting house door opened and then closed. She did not turn. She heard footsteps in the snow, not coming toward her, going the other direction. She turned then, not because she wanted to, but because something in the quality of those footsteps made her. They were too deliberate, too slow. The footsteps of a man who was giving himself time he did not know what to do with. Amos was walking away from the meeting house toward the far end of the settlement. His coat was dark against the white ground. His shoulders were set the way a man sets his shoulders when he is carrying something he has decided not to put down. She watched him until he turned the corner around the old Graber barn and was gone. She turned back to the fence line. She reached into the deep pocket of her dress, past the folded handkerchief, and the small knife she always carried for work down to the very bottom where she kept the thing she had kept for 11 years. The notebook was small, and its cover was worn smooth from years of handling. She did not take it out. She only rested her fingers against its spine. Then she heard something. Not the expected sounds of the settlement, not the horses or the cattle or the particular rhythm of the community's daily work. Something else. Metal against wood. The patient rhythmic sound of someone doing a small repair. She looked to her left. At the far end of the fence line, where the last post leaned at an angle that had been wrong for 2 seasons and that nobody had gotten around to fixing, a man was crouching in the snow. He had a hammer and a handful of nails, and he was working the post back to vertical with the particular careful attention of a man who is not in a hurry, because he understands that hurrying small repairs makes them into large ones. He was big. Not in the way of a man who has worked to become big, but in the way of a man who simply is that way. The way some trees are bigger than others on the same hillside. His coat was heavy canvas, patched at the shoulder. His hat was pulled low against the cold. His hands, even from a distance, were the hands of a man who had been working with them for a very long time. She watched him for a moment. He did not look up. She said, "That post has been wrong for 2 years." He did not startle. He set the nail and drove it with 3 clean strokes, and then looked up at her the way a man looks up from work when he expected to be interrupted eventually and has prepared himself. He said, "I know. I noticed it last time I was through. Took me a while to get back." She said, "Nobody asked you to fix it." He said, "I know that too." She looked at him. He looked at her. Not the way men in the settlement looked at her with the particular quality of assessment that always felt like being measured against a standard she had not agreed to. He looked at her the way a man looks at something when he is simply trying to understand what he is seeing. She said, "You are not of the community." He said, "No. My name is Silas Duff. I have land about 7 miles north and east. I buy flour and salt pork here when my stores run low." She said, "You heard?" He said, "The walls in that building are thick, but not as thick as people think." He set another nail. "I am sorry." She said, "You have nothing to be sorry for. You did not make the decision." He said, "No, but I heard it, and I did not do anything about it." That is its own kind of thing to be sorry for. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she looked back at the white field in front of her, at her own footprints in the snow, the only ones there were. She said, "You repaired a fence that no one asked you to repair, and apologized for something that was not your fault. You are a strange man, Mr. Duff." He said, "I have been told that." She said nothing else. She turned and walked back the way she had come, and she did not look back at him, and he did not call after her. She heard the hammer resume its rhythm behind her, 3 clean strokes, and then silence, 3 clean strokes, and then silence, growing quieter as she walked. That evening, she sat at the table in the house that would not be hers in 15 days. The lamp made a small circle of light. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and without wind. She opened the notebook to the last page, and she looked at the writing there. Writing from 11 years ago, small and careful. The penmanship of a girl who had been taught that neatness was next to godliness, and had taken the lesson seriously, even when she had not taken others. She had written in English. She had always written in English when she did not want to be understood by accident. She had written it on a spring evening in 1877, sitting in the dark outside the meeting house after the door had been closed to her. She had written it because she did not understand what she had heard, and because Elder Amos had taught her to write down the things she did not understand. She had trusted him enough to follow his teaching, even when the thing she was writing down was the sound of his voice speaking words she could not make sense of. 11 years. She had moved the notebook from drawer to pocket to the bottom of her traveling bag and back to her pocket again. She had read the page perhaps 100 times, and every time it had been the same words she had recorded faithfully, words she could not make fit together into something that meant what she feared. It meant words that waited in her handwriting, like a sentence she had copied without understanding the language. Tonight, she read them again. And for the first time, sitting alone in the house that would not be hers in 15 days, she felt the words click into place. Not all at once. In the way that a mechanism that has been stuck for years sometimes frees itself, not because something changes, but because enough force is applied from enough directions at once. She set the notebook down carefully on the table. She looked at the lamp. Then she opened the notebook again and read the page one more time to be sure. She was sure. She closed the notebook. She placed it in the pocket of her dress, pressed it flat against her ribs, and held it there with her hand. Outside, the snow fell on the field and on the fence line and on the grave markers behind the south wall of the meeting house, the ones with her father's name and her mother's name on them. Plain stone, short words, the way the community marked its dead. She sat with her hand pressed against the notebook until the lamp burned low. Then she went to bed and did not sleep for a very long time. He came the next morning. Ruth saw him from the window while she was heating water for coffee. He came on foot, not on horseback, which told her something. A man who approaches on foot is a man who has decided to take his time. He crossed the field from the north, where the settlement road connected to the open country, and he walked the way he had worked on the fence post without hurry and without performance. She did not go to the door when he knocked. She said, "Come in." "It is not locked." He came in and stood in the doorway with the cold coming off him in waves and his hat in his hand. He looked at the room with the same quality of attention he had given her the day before, quiet and without judgment, taking in what was there, without deciding what it should be instead. She said, "Sit down, Mr. Duff. I am making coffee." He sat. He placed his hat on the table and did not fidget with it. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across from him and looked at him in the full light of the morning. He was older than she had thought outside in the flat winter light. 40 perhaps, or a little past it. His face had the particular quality of men who have spent years in weather, not damaged by it, but marked by it the way good wood is marked by grain. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and across his forehead that suggested not age exactly, but a great deal of looking, a great deal of paying attention to things in the middle distance. His hands around the coffee cup were large and steady. He said, "I will not take up much of your time." She said, "You are not taking it. I have a good deal of it at present." A very small change moved through his expression, something that was almost a smile, and then decided to be something quieter. He said, "I am going to say something plain. You can tell me to leave after if you want." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "I need a wife. Not for sentiment. I need someone who can work and who knows how to manage a household through a Montana winter, because one person alone on that land is too thin a margin. Last winter, I came close to not making it to spring, and I am not a man who makes excuses for the same mistake twice." He looked at her steadily. You need a name that lets you stay in this territory without belonging to a congregation that has decided to let you go. Those are two problems that fit together. It is not a romantic thing to say, but I am not a romantic man. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "That is the most practical thing anyone has said to me in 30 years. He said, "I take that as encouragement." She said, "You should not take it as anything yet." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the surface of the liquid. Then she looked at him again. She said, "Have you ever been in love, Mr. Duff?" Something happened in his face. Not evasion, not the careful blankness of a man closing a door. It was more like a man looking directly at a thing he has trained himself not to look away from even when looking hurts. He said, "Yes, and I was not enough of what she needed when she needed it most. I came close to something once, and I failed to stay close to it, and I will not pretend that is not what happened." He set his coffee cup down. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He simply stated it the way you state the dimensions of a room when you need to know if the furniture will fit. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most honest answer to that question I have ever received." He said, "I am not an interesting man, Mrs. Ruth, but I am an honest one." She said, "That is not a small thing." He said, "No, I do not think it is." She looked at the table between them, at his hat sitting there beside the notebook she had left out without thinking. Then she said, "I need a day to think." He stood up. He picked up his hat. He said, "Take 2 if you need them, but not more. You have 15 days, and I would rather use some of them to prepare properly." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, "Whatever you decide, I will fix that fence post properly in the spring. The temporary repair will hold until then." Then he was gone. She heard his footsteps on the packed snow outside, and then the footsteps faded, and there was only the sound of the wind beginning to pick up from the west, and the small sounds of the house settling around her, the way old houses do, as though they are trying to get comfortable. She sat at the table for a long time. Then she put on her coat and her boots and her heaviest shawl, and she went to do the thing she had always done when she needed to think clearly. The cemetery behind the south wall of the meeting house was empty of living people on this particular morning. The sky was still the same flat pewter, the snow still untracked in most directions. Her parents' markers were side by side under the 2 large stones she had chosen and paid for herself. Stone from the hills to the east that had a particular gray-blue color she associated with her mother's kitchen in winter. She stood between the markers and she talked to them the way she had always talked to them, without ceremony, without the formal language of prayer, the way you talk to people you have known so long that formality between you would be an insult. She said, "Mama, there is a man who wants to marry me. He is not handsome. He is not charming. He fixed a fence post that nobody asked him to fix, and he told me the truth about his dead wife without being asked and without making it prettier than it was." She paused. She looked at the bare branches of the elm at the corner of the cemetery, black against the pale sky. She said, "I think that might be enough. I think that might be more than enough." She heard something behind her. She turned. Henry Schrock was standing at the gap in the stone wall, where the path came through his cap in his hands, and his face red from cold, or from embarrassment, which on a 14-year-old boy looked nearly the same. She said, "How long have you been standing there?" He said. "A while," she said. "You heard all of that." He looked at the ground. He said, "Mostly." She waited. He looked up at her finally the way young people look at you when they have decided to say something that costs them something. He said, "I think you should go, Miss Ruth." He stopped. His voice had the rough unsteadiness of a boy whose voice was still deciding what it was going to be. He said, "They are not right about you here. They have never been right about you. But," he stopped again. She said, "But," he said, "I will miss you." He said it fast, the way you say things you have been building up to for too long. She looked at him for a moment. This boy, who had come to her 3 years ago, unable to read a single word, whose father had died of a summer fever, and whose mother had too many other children to worry about the one who learned slowly, who had sat at her kitchen table 4 evenings a week while she taught him with the patience she had in abundance, because patience was what she had instead of the things she lacked. She said, "You already know how to read." She said, "That is yours. Nobody can take that from you." He looked at the ground again. He nodded without lifting his face. She said, "Come here." He came. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, firm and steady. Then she turned back to her parents' markers and she said, "I am going to go now." She said it to the stones, to the ground, to the sky. She said, "I think this is the right thing. I think you would understand." The wind came up across the cemetery and moved through the bare elm branches and then went still. She took that as what it was. She told Amos the next morning. Not to ask permission. She had stopped asking permission from anyone for anything a long time ago. She told him because he was family, which was something she had not entirely finished being loyal to even now. He was in his workshop behind the house he had shared with his wife until her death 4 years before. He was mending a harness. He did not look up when she came in, which meant he had seen her coming through the small workshop window and had decided how he was going to be when she arrived. She said, "I am going to marry Silas Duff." He set down the harness. He turned on his stool. He looked at her. She waited. He said, "He is English." She said, "He is a man with land and a house, and the honesty to tell me exactly what he is offering and what he is not." She paused. She said, "You gave me 15 days, Uncle. I am using 3 of them." He looked at his hands. He had the same hands her mother had had, wide across the knuckles, the kind of hands that showed every year of the work they had done. He said, "I cannot stop you." She said, "I know." He said, "The congregation will not recognize it as a proper marriage." She said, "The congregation has 15 days ago made its position regarding me very clear." She kept her voice level. She kept her eyes on his face. She said, "I will need you to perform the ceremony." He looked up at her then. Really looked. She saw something in his expression that she could not entirely name, something with too many things in it at once: shame and grief, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has begun to doubt whether he set it down anywhere near the right place. He said, "Ruth." She waited. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said, "I want you to know." He stopped. She waited. He looked at his hands again. He said nothing more. The workshop was quiet around them, the smell of leather and oil and cold wood. Outside, the wind moved across the roof. She said, "The ceremony." "Uncle, Wednesday morning." She turned to go. He said, "What time?" She stopped. She said, 9 o'clock. She walked out without looking back. Wednesday came, gray and cold and still. The meeting house held 23 people, which was most of the congregation, which told her that word traveled the way it always had in small closed communities, which was instantly and completely. Amos performed the ceremony in 30 minutes, which was shorter than any German Baptist wedding Ruth had ever attended. There was no celebration. There was no food laid out after. There was the ceremony, and then there was the signing of the paper that Silas had brought already drafted in his steady, unpracticed hand. And then there was the moment when Amos said the words that made it legal under the law of Montana Territory, and therefore the only law that was going to matter to Ruth from this point forward. Silas stood beside her through all of it, with the stillness of a man who has decided to be exactly where he is and has no energy to spare for being anywhere else. He was not nervous. He was not performing ease. He was simply present, which she was beginning to understand was what he was, instead of charming. When Amos said, "It is done," he looked at Amos the way you look at someone when you have understood something about them that they have not said. And then he looked at Ruth, and he said very quietly, only to her. "Ready?" She said, "Yes." Nora Graber was standing in the second row of the assembly. Ruth saw her when she turned toward the door, saw the look on her face, which was the look of a woman who is watching something she should have prevented and knows she cannot prevent it now, whose moment for action was 11 years ago, and again 3 days ago, and who has stood in both moments with her feet planted and her mouth closed. Nora opened her mouth. Ruth looked at her directly, held her eyes for a moment, and then looked away. Not in anger, not in cruelty. In the simple final way you look away from something when you have decided you do not have time for it anymore. Silas's hand came to the small of her back, not possessive, not dramatic, only present, guiding her toward the door. She walked through it. Outside, Henry Schrock was waiting. He had his cap pressed to his chest, and his eyes were too bright in the cold air, and he looked exactly like what he was, which was a 14-year-old boy trying very hard not to cry in public. She stopped in front of him. She said, "Study every day." He said, "I will." She said, "Even when no one is checking." He said, "I know." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she let Silas help her up onto the wagon seat, which was high, and the step was narrow, and she settled herself as Silas came around and took the reins. The wagon began to move. The snow packed down under the wheels with a sound like something being decided. She heard running feet behind them. She looked back over her shoulder. Henry had broken into a run, his coat open, and his cap flying, running along the side of the wagon with his arm extended. She reached out. His fingers found hers and gripped for one moment, one real full moment of contact, and then the wagon was moving faster than he could run, and his hand slipped away. He stopped running. He stood in the road behind them with the settlement spreading out behind him, and his arm still extended, and his hand opened the way hands look after something they were holding has been released. She turned forward. She did not turn back again. The settlement grew small behind them, and smaller still. And then the road curved north through a stand of old pines, and the settlement was gone, replaced by the white open country and the pewter sky and the sound of the horses and the creak of the wagon and the cold working its way through her coat. They rode in silence. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have agreed to something and are now sitting with the weight of what they have agreed to, which is a different thing from the silence of people who have nothing to say. After a time, Silas said, "You can ask me things. I would rather you ask me than wonder." She said, "I know." She thought for a moment. She said, "The woman. Your wife." He said, "Clara." She said, "How long?" He said, 7 years since she passed. 2 years sick before that. She said, "Were you with her at the end?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, I was not." He said it the way people say things they have said before, only to themselves. Words that have been turned over so many times they have become smooth. I was 3 days ride away when it happened. I came home and she was already in the ground. She said, "I am sorry." He said, "So am I." And then after a pause, he said, "She never blamed me. That was the thing I could not understand and still cannot. She never once blamed me, and I have never been able to decide if that was mercy or if it was its own kind of damage." Ruth looked at the country passing on either side of the road, the white fields, and the dark line of the trees, and the distant hills going blue in the cold afternoon. She said, "I think mercy and damage can be the same thing sometimes." He glanced at her. He did not say anything, but the quality of his attention shifted in a way she could feel even without looking at him. She reached into her coat pocket. She brought out the notebook. She held it in both hands in her lap, not opening it, just holding it. He looked at it briefly and then back at the road. She said, "I have kept this for 11 years. She said it quietly, not dramatically. "There are things written in it that I wrote down when I was 19 because I heard something I did not understand and I did not want to forget it." He said, "And now you understand it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Is it something that matters?" She looked down at the notebook in her hands. At the worn cover, the smooth spine, the small crease across the front where she had dropped it once years ago and never been able to fully press out. She said, "I think it might be the most important thing I have." He nodded once, the kind of nod that is not agreement, but acknowledgement, the kind that says, "I hear you, and I am not going to press you, and I will still be here when you are ready to say more." She pressed the notebook back against her ribs beneath her coat and held it there with her hand over her heart. The road narrowed as it climbed north. The pines closed in on either side, tall and dark, and holding their snow in thick banks along the branches. The air changed the way air changes when you leave open country and enter the shelter of trees, quieter and more particular, and carrying the particular cold smell of pine and frozen ground. In the wagon seat beside her, Silas drove with the ease of a man who has made this road many times in many conditions. His hands were easy on the reins. His eyes were on the road ahead. She looked at him in profile. The lines of his face in the late afternoon light, the steadiness of his shoulders, the hat pulled low against the cold. She thought about what he had said, about Clara, about mercy and damage being the same thing, about coming home 3 days too late. She thought about the notebook against her ribs and the words inside it and the things she had spent 11 years not quite understanding that she now understood with a clarity that felt like cold water, like the sudden recognition of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. She thought about Amos opening his mouth and closing it and opening it again. "I want you to know." She had not let him finish. She was not sure yet whether that had been wisdom or its own kind of damage. Far ahead, through the trees where the road curved east and began to climb toward the high country, she could see the first faint blue shadow of the mountains. A long way off, a long way up. Her new home was somewhere in that direction. She kept her hand pressed flat against the notebook beneath her coat, and she looked toward the mountains, and she thought, "Whatever is in this, whatever these words mean, whatever it cost me not to understand them for 11 years, I understand them now. And I am still here. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all." The wagon rolled on through the darkening afternoon, through the quiet pines, into the high country, toward a cabin she had not yet seen, beside a man she had not yet learned, carrying 11 years of words she had finally learned to read. And behind her, growing smaller with every turn of the wheels, the settlement at Heartland's Crossing sat in its own cold quiet, with its plain meeting house and its stone markers, and its careful, deliberate windows, and its silences that were not the absence of speech. And in his workshop, Elder Amos Byler sat on his stool with a harness in his hands that he had not resumed mending, looking at the wall in front of him with the expression of a man who has opened a door he has kept closed for a very long time, and is only now beginning to understand what has been standing on the other side of it all these years. And on the settlement road, in the place where the tracks of the wagon wheels turned north and disappeared into the pines, a 14-year-old boy named Henry Schrock was walking back toward the settlement with his hands in his pockets and his cap back on his head. And he was not crying, not quite, but his jaw was set in the way of someone who has decided to be the kind of person who does not cry and has not yet finished deciding whether that is the right decision. He walked back slowly. He had no particular reason to hurry. He thought about what she had said. "That is yours. Nobody can take that from you." He turned the words over in his mind the way she had taught him to turn sentences over, looking at them from all sides, finding what they meant under what they said. He walked back into the settlement. He went home. He sat at the kitchen table. He found the page in the primer she had left him 6 months ago, the one he had gotten to and then stopped at because the words got harder and there was no one to ask. He started reading again. The cabin appeared through the pines at dusk when the last light was doing what last light does in Montana in December, which is not so much setting as surrendering, pulling back from the world in increments until the world is left to manage itself in the dark. Ruth saw it first as a shape, and then as a structure, and then as Silas guided the horses through the final curve of the road as a place. There is a difference. A shape is geometry. A structure is intention. A place is something that has accumulated time, that has absorbed the presence of the people who have lived in it, and held that presence the way wood holds warmth, slowly and unevenly, and longer than you would expect. The cabin was built from timber so thick the walls looked permanent in a way that most things in Montana Territory did not. The stone chimney rose from the east end of the roof and was already smoking, which meant Silas had banked a fire before he left. Which meant he had thought ahead, which she filed away without comment. The windows were small and deep-set, the glass old and slightly wavy, in the way of glass that had traveled far before arriving where it was. There was a covered porch along the south face. There was a woodpile stacked head-high along the north wall, split and covered with canvas, and stacked with the particular tightness of a man who has been cold before and has decided opinions about not being cold again. Silas brought the wagon to a stop in the clearing before the porch and climbed down and came around to her side. He offered his hand. She took it not because she could not manage the step herself, but because he had offered it simply without the strained helpfulness of a man making a point about her size, and accepting it simply seemed the right response. Her boots found the packed snow of the clearing, and she stood for a moment and looked at the cabin and the smoke rising from the chimney and the dark tree line pressing in on three sides, and the sky above going from gray to the particular purple gray of true winter evening. Silas said, "It is warmer inside." She said, "I imagine it is." She followed him in. The main room was larger than the outside, suggested the way well-built rooms sometimes are the proportions thought through rather than simply imposed. There was a stone hearth along the east wall, with a fire going low and ready to be built up. There was a table of thick pine boards smoothed by years of use to a surface that was not quite polished, but not rough either. There were 2 chairs at the table and 2 chairs by the hearth, and it was the hearth chairs that Ruth noticed first, because one of them had the particular settled look of a chair that has been used regularly for a long time, shaped by use into a specific kind of welcome, and the other had a layer of dust along the armrests that was thin enough to be recent, but present enough to be real. Someone had wiped the seat of the second chair. Not the arms, just the seat. She looked at that chair for a moment. Then she looked away and looked at the shelves along the north wall, the rows of jars and the tools hung on pegs and the folded blankets on the high shelf and the stack of harness leather on the workbench near the door. She looked at the wall across from the hearth, where there was a square of slightly darker wood, the ghost of something rectangular that had hung there long enough to protect the wall behind it from the particular fading that smoke and time and light perform on interior walls. She said, "You had something there." Silas was at the hearth building up the fire from the banked coals. He did not look up. He said, "A mirror." Clara did not like to look at herself near the end. "I took it down." He added another piece of wood unhurried. He said, "I kept meaning to put something else there." He did not say what had prevented him. Ruth looked at the dark square on the wall. She thought about a woman who had not wanted to see herself. She thought about what it costs a person to reach a point where the sight of their own face has become something to avoid. She said, "How long ago did she pass?" Silas said 4 years, this March. Ruth said nothing more about it. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg nearest the door. She unwound her shawl. She set her traveling bag on the bench near the work table. She looked at the pot on the iron hook over the fire, from which a smell was rising that was substantial and promising venison and root vegetables, and something herbed that she could not identify precisely, but that suggested a man who cooked for function rather than pleasure, but had learned the basic requirements of the former well enough. She said, "That smells like it has been going since morning." He said, "Since yesterday. It improves." She said, "Most things do." She found the bowl shelf without asking and took down 2 bowls and 2 spoons and set the table, and he ladled without comment, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and ate. The stew was what it smelled like, solid and functional and genuinely good. The work of a man who had cooked alone long enough to have figured out what mattered and what did not. They did not talk much during the meal. This was not awkward. It had the quality of 2 people who have agreed to something and are now existing in the same space while they figure out what existing in the same space is going to mean. The fire built up and the room warmed, and outside, the wind moved through the pines with the particular low sound that pines make, a sound that is not threatening but is not comforting, either only honest about the scale of what surrounds you. After the meal, she washed the bowls and he dried them, which she had not expected, and he stacked them on the shelf in the wrong place, which she did not correct because it was his house, and the shelf arrangement would reveal itself over time through use. Later, when the lamps were turned down and the fire had settled to coals, and she was lying in the bed in the main room that he had indicated was hers, listening to his footsteps on the floor above, in the loft, she lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the square of darker wood on the wall where the mirror had been. She thought about the chair with the clean seat and the dusty arms. She thought about a man who had been alone for 7 years in this room, who had kept the second chair, who had kept the second bowl, who had banked the fire before he left so that it would be warm when someone came back to it. She closed her eyes. She was not sure what she was feeling. It was not the things she had expected to feel, which were fear and loss and the particular grief of a woman who has been told for so long that she is not wanted that she has half believed it. Those things were there, but underneath them was something else, something quieter and less familiar. It felt distantly like the possibility of being all right. She did not trust it yet, but she noted it. She filed it away, the way she filed things she did not yet understand. She slept. The first 2 weeks passed in the way that new arrangements pass when both people in them are determined to be honest and neither is certain what honesty between strangers is supposed to look like. They worked. That was the clearest thing and the easiest. Ruth was not a woman who had ever had difficulty finding work to do. There was bread to bake, and she baked it, learning the particular quirks of the iron stove in the first 2 days, the way it ran hot on the right side and needed watching when the wind came from the north. There were stores to inventory and organize, and she did that too, finding the logic of Silas's arrangement and working within it rather than imposing her own, noting where the logic failed, and making small adjustments that he would not necessarily notice, but that would make things easier over time. Silas split wood every morning and checked the trap lines and made small repairs to the barn and the fence and the equipment with the steady, unshowy competence of a man who has maintained things alone for long enough that maintenance has become reflex. He did not explain his work to her and did not ask about hers, but she noticed that he always knew where she was, not in the way of a man watching, but in the way of a man who is keeping a quiet accounting of the place and the people in it, making sure everything is where it should be. On the 4th morning, she woke before him and stoked the fire and made coffee and stood at the south window in the dark before dawn and watched the sky go from black to the deep blue of early winter morning. When she turned around, Silas was sitting at the table. He had come downstairs without sound, which for a large man was a particular skill. He said, "You are an early riser." She said, "I have always woken before light. I do not know why." He said, "I used to fight it." He poured coffee from the pot she had left on the stove. He said, "Now I think there is something right about it, seeing the world before it has gotten started, like reading the first line of something before anyone else has gotten to it." She looked at him over her cup. It was the longest and most figurative thing he had said since she had arrived. She filed it away. He sat at the table and looked at the window and drank his coffee. After a while, he stood up and went out to the wood. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the window and watched the sky go from deep blue to the particular pale gray of Montana winter dawn, which was not beautiful exactly, but was large, which was sometimes better. On the 9th night, the thing happened that changed the quality of the arrangement into something she could not yet name, but that felt like more than an arrangement. She had waited until Silas's footsteps overhead had gone quiet, and the loft had been still for 20 minutes before she brought out the book. It was not that she was ashamed of it. It was that she had spent so long being careful about it that caution had become habit. The Pilgrim's Progress. 1878. Printing bought from a traveling book merchant 7 years before for a sum that had felt extravagant, and had proved worth every cent. She read it slowly, the way she read everything, turning the meaning over, looking at it from different angles, reading sentences twice when they seemed to say more than they were saying. She was 2/3 through when she heard the stairs. She did not close the book. She thought about it and decided against it, because closing it would be more revealing than leaving it open, because it would suggest she believed she was doing something wrong, and she had decided some time ago to stop suggesting things she did not believe. Silas came off the last stair and stood in the doorway between the loft stairs and the main room. He had not lit a lamp. The firelight was enough to see by low and orange. He looked at her, and he looked at the book, and he was quiet for a moment. She said, "I could not sleep." He said, "Neither could I." He came into the room and sat down in his chair, the one that had been used so long it knew the shape of him. He looked at the book in her hands. He said, "You read English." She said, "I have since I was 15. I taught myself from books I was not supposed to have." She said it plainly, without apology or challenge. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have read English since I was 8. My mother taught me." He looked at the fire. He said, "I cannot tell you that I understand everything in a book like that one, but I understand more of it than I used to." She said, "You have read it." He said, "Clara had a copy." He said it without particular weight. He said, "I read it to her in the evenings." Near the end, she could not hold a book herself. Ruth looked at him. He was looking at the fire with the same expression he had when she had asked him about Clara the first evening. The one that was not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had been grief for long enough that it had changed into something harder to name. She said, "Was she a reader?" He said, "She was. More than me. She would have liked to have had more books." He paused. He said, "I should have gotten her more books." The fire settled. The wind moved through the pines outside. Ruth looked down at the open pages in her lap and then back at him. She reached across and set the book on the table between them, cover up readable from his side. He looked at it. He reached out and turned it a few degrees, as though adjusting the angle. He did not read from it. He did not pick it up, but he left his hand near it on the table, and he sat there in the firelight while she read and did not go back upstairs for a long time. This was, Ruth would think later, the first true thing that happened between them. Not the wedding, not the practicalities of the first days, but this two people sitting in a room in the middle of the night with a fire going low and a book between them, not performing anything for anyone, only being what they were. 3 weeks after her arrival, a letter came. The post rider came through the high country every 10 days in winter, less if the weather was bad, and when he came, he left whatever he had at the wooden box at the junction of the road 1/2 a mile below the cabin. Silas checked it when he thought of it, which was roughly every week. He brought 2 things in from the box on a Tuesday morning in early January. One was a supply catalog he had ordered in October. The other was a small, folded piece of paper with no envelope addressed in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped the handwriting of someone who did not write often and was aware of it. He set both things on the table and said, "One is for you." Ruth looked at the folded paper. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it on labels in the Graber kitchen and on the edges of the communal harvest ledger for years. She took the paper and opened it. It said, in the cramped, careful hand, "Ruth, I do not know how to begin this. I have begun it 4 times and thrown each one away. I am going to write this one and send it before I think about it again. I am not writing to excuse myself. I do not think I can. I am writing because I need to know you are all right, even if you do not want to answer. You do not have to answer. I only need to know." It was signed Nora. Ruth folded the paper and set it on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the supply catalog and handed it to Silas and said, "Is there anything here you need me to look at?" He said, "The flower. Page 12. She turned to page 12. She did not speak about the letter, but 3 days later, she sat at the table in the morning while Silas was at the barn and she took out a piece of paper from the small supply she kept in the bottom of her traveling bag, and she wrote 7 sentences. She folded the paper and wrote Nora's name on it and set it aside to give to the postwriter the next time he came through. The 7 sentences said, "I am all right. The cabin is solid and the winter is manageable. The man I married is honest and not unkind. I do not know yet what else to tell you. There are things I have thought about for a long time that I am still thinking about. I am not ready to speak about them in a letter. But I am all right." She did not sign it. Nora would know. It was in the 4th week that she found the small folded garment in the trunk at the foot of Silas's bed. She was not searching. She was reorganizing the extra blankets which had been stored in a way that made the bottom ones inaccessible, and the trunk needed to be partly emptied to do the job properly. She lifted the blankets out one by one, and there it was, at the very bottom, folded with the particular care of something that is precious, but cannot be displayed, a small knitted garment in cream-colored wool, sized for a child of perhaps 3 or 4 years old, a sweater with small wooden buttons. She held it for a moment. The wool was fine and even. Someone had knitted it well, someone who knew what they were doing, who had taken time with the work. She thought about Clara reading in the evenings. She thought about a woman who had liked books and had not had enough of them. She refolded the sweater carefully, matching the original creases, and placed it back at the bottom of the trunk, and replaced the blankets and finished the reorganization. She said nothing about it that day. 2 days later in the evening, when Silas had been sitting for an hour with his glass of whiskey and his particular quality of presence that meant he was somewhere other than the room while still being physically in it, she said, without looking up from her mending, "Did you have children?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was looking at the fire. He said, "A son. Thomas." He said the name, the way you say a name you have kept private for a long time carefully, as though the shape of it in the air is something to be handled. She said, "How old?" He said 4. "When he died?" She said, "What year?" He said, 82. "Winter fever?" He paused. He said, "I was away, trying to add to the money for the spring planting." He said it without inflection. He had said it to himself enough times that the inflection had worn off. "I was 3 days right away when it happened. By the time I got home, he had been in the ground a week. Clara had done it all. Alone." Ruth kept her hands on her mending, but she had stopped sewing. She said, "And Clara, after." He said, "She was never quite the same. Not in a way you could point to. Just..." He moved his hand, slightly, a small, imprecise gesture that was more honest than words would have been. She was present, but she was not all there. Part of her went with him. He paused again. "She died 2 years later. The doctor said it was her lungs." He looked at his glass. "I have never been entirely sure that was the whole of it." Ruth set her mending down. She said, "I am sorry, Silas." He said, "I know." He looked at her briefly. He said, "Thank you for asking. No one has asked me in a long time. People stopped asking after the 1st year. I think they thought it was kind." He looked back at the fire. It was lonelier than being asked. The fire burned. The wind came and went outside. Ruth picked up her mending again, and they sat in the quiet that had come to feel over 4 weeks like a thing they had built together, without planning, to the way you build a path by walking the same way enough times. After a while, Silas said, "You can ask me other things, when you want to." She said, "I know." He said, "I will try to answer honestly." She said, "I know that too." Outside, the pines moved in the dark, and the snow settled on the roof with the faint sound of accumulation, the sound of weight being added incrementally slowly over a long time, in a way that you only notice when you stop and listen for it. January deepened around the cabin, the way January deepens in the high country, not dramatically, but comprehensively, working its way into everything, until cold is not a condition, but the condition, the baseline, against which all other things are measured. The letters between Ruth and Nora continued. Nora wrote every 10 days, which was as often as the postwriter came, which meant she was writing immediately upon receiving Ruth's previous letter, which told Ruth something about the urgency behind the writing. Nora's letters were cautious at first, carrying the particular carefulness of a person who is not sure how much is welcome, who is testing the temperature of the water before committing to the depth. Ruth's responses were short. They were not cold, but they were economical, which was not the same thing. She answered what was asked. She did not offer more than was requested. She had been doing this long enough with enough different people that it came naturally. The management of the amount of herself she made available, the careful regulation of the door. But she kept writing back. In the 5th week, Nora wrote something that was different from the other letters. It was longer. The handwriting was less careful, which meant it had been written quickly, which meant it was less considered, which meant it was probably more true. Nora wrote, "I keep thinking about that morning. Not last month, 11 years ago. I have thought about it many times since, but lately, I cannot stop thinking about it. I keep asking myself what I was afraid of. I was 20 years old, and I was afraid of something, and I stood there, and I did not say a word while they told you in front of everyone. I have told myself many things about why over the years. None of them have ever felt like the real answer. I think the real answer is that I was a coward, and I did not know it yet, because I had not been tested yet. I know it now. I do not know what to do with knowing it." Ruth read this letter twice. She sat with it for the rest of the morning. In the afternoon, she wrote back a single paragraph. It said, "You were 20 years old. I was 20 years old. We were both very young, and the people around us were very sure of what they wanted from us, and neither of us had yet figured out how much that certainty was allowed to cost us. I am not saying this to excuse what happened. I am saying it because I have spent 11 years being harder on myself than I needed to be about that, and about other things, and I have recently started to wonder whether I should try doing that less. I think you might benefit from the same thought." She folded the letter and set it aside. Then she went to the shelf where she kept her notebook, and she took it down and opened it to the last page, to the words she had read 100 times and recently begun to read differently. She sat at the table and read them again. She had written them on a spring evening in 1877 when she was 19 years old, sitting in the dark outside the meeting house after the door had been closed to her. The writing was small and precise, the work of a girl who had been taught that neatness mattered, and it covered most of the page in lines, so even they might have been ruled. She had written down what she heard through the meeting house wall. She had written it in English because that was the language she used for things she was hiding, things she needed to keep separate from the daily world, things she was not ready to explain. She had written, "A man came tonight. I do not know his name. He spoke with Uncle Amos for a long time. I heard the word money several times, and the word land several times, and the word arrangements, and the word discretion. Uncle Amos's voice was not the voice he uses in the community. It was lower and more careful, the way people speak when they are deciding things they do not want witnessed. I heard my own name. I heard Jacob Mast's name. I did not understand what was being said about us. I wrote this down so that one day I might. She had been 19, and she had heard her name and Jacob Mast's name, and she had written it down, and then she had spent the following weeks watching Jacob Mast avoid her eyes in the way that a man avoids the eyes of someone he is going to disappoint before he has done it yet. And then Jacob had come to her and told her that he had given the matter great thought and prayer, and had determined that a marriage between them was not the Lord's will, and she had stood in the center of the meeting house while he said it in front of the congregation, because Amos had thought it best to handle such matters with the full community present to prevent rumor. And she had stood straight because she had always stood straight, and she had not cried because she had not let herself, and she had walked out of the meeting house and gone home, and sat at her table and looked at the page in her notebook where she had written down the thing she did not understand. She had read it many times since. She had felt the shape of something wrong inside it, but never been able to see the thing itself. The way you sometimes sense a stone under shallow water, without being able to see it clearly through the light and movement on the surface. But in December, on the wagon seat with Silas beside her, and the settlement disappearing behind her, and 11 years of accumulated understanding suddenly available to be applied to 11-year-old words, she had read it, and the stone had come clear. She read it again now in January in Silas's cabin with the fire going, and the cold outside, and the pines moving in the wind. She read, I heard my own name. I heard Jacob Mast's name. She read, money, land, arrangements, discretion. She read Uncle Amos's voice was not the voice he uses in the community. She thought about what she now knew about Dean Proctor. She thought about the man who had come to collect his debt from Silas 7 miles north of Heartland's crossing on a Tuesday in January, who had been polite and specific and had looked at Ruth with the eyes of a man calculating the value of everything he sees. She thought about land. She thought about arrangements. She thought about the particular year 1877 and what had been happening in that year in the Montana Territory, which was the beginning of the decade-long expansion of certain kinds of men into certain kinds of territory. Men with money and lawyers and the particular patience of people who are willing to wait because they know that waiting is itself a form of pressure. She thought about a congregation that had built a new meeting house in 1878, and she had always known that the money had come from somewhere and had never thought to ask where. She sat at the table for a long time. 3 weeks earlier, she had written to a woman in Billings named Catherine Erb, who had attended the same traveling school as Ruth the summer of 1876, and who had lived in Helena for 6 years before moving east, and who knew, as women who live in towns know the faces and names and connections of the families that move through them. Ruth had asked one question. Catherine had answered it in 10 days with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understands that when someone asks a careful question, they deserve a careful answer. The reply was in the traveling bag under the bed. Ruth had read it 4 times. Jacob Mast had married Dean Proctor's youngest daughter in the spring of 1879. The wedding had been in Helena. Catherine had attended. Then she heard the barn door, which meant Silas was coming in, and she closed the notebook and held it in her hands and waited. He came through the door with cold coming off him and snow on his shoulders, and his face ruddied from the work and the weather. He looked at her sitting at the table with the notebook in her hands, and he said nothing, only hung his coat and poured water to wash his hands. She said, Silas, what do you know about Dean Proctor beyond what happened with your land? He dried his hands. He came and sat across from her. He said, I know he came to Montana Territory in 1875 with enough money to buy land and enough patience to wait for more. I know he has been buying parcels all across the Eastern Territory, some of them through lawyers, some through what I would call less formal arrangements. He looked at his hands. I know that in 1885, I saw him buy a parcel from a family that had been pushed off it by circumstances that looked accidental from the outside and did not look that way from close up. I testified to that effect before a territorial judge, and the judge ruled against Proctor, and Proctor lost the parcel and a considerable amount of money. He looked at her, and I know that a man like that does not forget. She said, when did he start coming to the settlements, the religious communities, the German Baptist communities? Silas looked at her for a moment. He said, I do not know exactly. Before 80, I think. There was a Mennonite settlement east of Billings that had troubles in 78-79. I heard about it secondhand. He said, why she set the notebook on the table between them. She said, I think he came to Harlan's Crossing in 77. I think he spoke with Elder Amos Byler, and I think money changed hands. She said it carefully exactly. I think the arrangement involved information about which families in the community were vulnerable, which properties might become available, and I think the arrangement extended at some point to influence over decisions within the community, including decisions about specific people. Silas looked at the notebook. He looked at her face. He said, you heard this. She said, I heard part of it when I was 19. I wrote down what I heard because I did not understand it. She tapped the notebook. It is all here. It has been here for 11 years. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the pines made their sounds. She watched his face, which was doing the thing faces do when a person is laying new information over existing information and seeing how the shapes fit. He said, "And you think Amos knew what was being arranged? With you? With Jacob Mast?" She said, "I think Jacob Mast was Dean Proctor's son-in-law." Silas went very still. She said, "I did not know that until last week. I wrote to a woman in Billings who had been to school with me. She knows the Proctor family by sight. She confirmed it. Jacob Mast married Proctor's youngest daughter in 1879. 2 years after he stood in front of our congregation and told me the Lord had told him we were not meant for each other." Silas sat back slowly. He looked at the notebook. He said, "What would Proctor have wanted with you, with your family's land?" She said, "My family's land sits on the south side of the creek that runs through the settlement. The north side belongs to the community. But the south side, my family's side, is the only place where the creek can be bridged without considerable cost. Anyone who wants to move goods through that corridor efficiently, anyone who wants to develop that land for grazing or farming at a larger scale, needs that bridge. And the only way to get that bridge is to control the land on the south bank." She paused. "He wanted our land. The simplest way to get it was to make sure I had no husband, no family, no claim to it. A woman alone in a community that has decided she is a burden does not hold on to land very long." Silas looked at her for a long time. He said, "And Amos?" She said Amos was presented with an arrangement. "I believe he was told the story of what was planned. I believe he was offered money which the congregation needed, and I believe he was given the choice that men like Proctor always offer, which is not a real choice, but has the shape of one. He could protect me and lose what the community needed, or he could look the other way and tell himself that the Lord would provide for me some other way." Silas said he chose the money. She said he chose the community. Those are not the same thing, but I think he convinced himself they were. The fire burned. The cabin was very quiet. Then Silas reached out and put his hand flat on the table, close to, but not touching the notebook. He said, "Ruth, this is enough for a judge, if you are willing to testify." She said, "I know." He said, "Proctor will not stop at my land if you go to a court with this." She said, "He has not stopped at your land already. He has only not gotten to the other things yet." Silas looked at her. She looked at him. The lamp on the table between them made a circle of light that covered the notebook in their hands and not much else. She said, "The night before we left, I said I thought I might be the witness you needed. I did not know then how right I was." He said, "This is not a small thing to ask yourself to do." She said, "Nobody asked me." She said it without sharpness. "I have been sitting with these words for 11 years, and I have spent all of that time not knowing what they meant, and now I know. There is only one thing to do with a thing you finally understand." He looked at her for a long moment more. Then he nodded, once the way he nodded, which was not agreement, but acknowledgement, which she had learned was his way of saying, "I hear you, and I believe you, and I will not stand in the way." She picked up the notebook and held it in both hands and thought about Amos opening his mouth 3 times and closing it 3 times in the cold workshop behind his house. "I want you to know." She thought about what he had wanted her to know. She thought about a man who had made a choice 11 years ago and had lived inside that choice every day since, who had voted to send her away and had not been able to look at her when she asked him about the 5th vote, who had run his hands over a harness he was not mending, and opened his mouth and not been able to finish the sentence. She thought about the moment she had not let him finish it. She was not sure yet whether that was the right thing to have done. She suspected she would need to find out. Outside, the wind came off the mountains and moved through the pines and shook the snow from the upper branches in small cascades that fell past the windows like brief curtains of white. And then the wind passed, and the pines went still, and the snow settled back to its long, patient accumulation on everything below. Ruth held the notebook, and Silas sat across from her, and the fire burned between them, and neither of them spoke for a while, because they had said what needed to be said, and what needed to be done next was not talk, but the particular kind of quiet that comes before a decision has been made, but after the decision has become inevitable. In the morning, she wrote a longer letter to Nora. She asked Nora to do something she had never asked anyone for anything. She wrote it plainly in the straightforward way she had written everything since she had learned that plain words were the only words she could trust. She wrote, "I need to know if there are people in the community who have seen or heard things over the years that connect Elder Amos to Dean Proctor in any way. People who might be willing to say so in writing. I know what I am asking. I know what it costs to say difficult things about a man who holds authority. I would not ask if I did not believe it was necessary. I believe it is necessary." She sent the letter. Then she sat across from Silas at the breakfast table, and she said, "I have asked Nora to look into something for me." He said, "What kind of something?" She said, "The kind that would take longer to explain than we have before. The fire needs more wood." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives next to a smile in a person who does not smile easily, a kind of warmth that is more trustworthy for being quiet. He said, "I will get the wood. You explain when I come back." He got up and went out to the woodpile. She sat at the table and looked at the notebook lying open on the surface before her, at the 11-year-old words in the careful hand of a 19-year-old girl who had not known what she was recording. She thought, "You wrote it down. You always wrote it down, even when you did not know why. And now you know why." Outside, the sound of the axe came through the walls, clean and regular. The sound of Silas doing what Silas did, which was attend to the practical thing that was in front of him. And she thought that there were worse qualities in a man than the willingness to go out in the cold and split wood when wood was needed, and that she had perhaps underestimated how much she had needed to be in a place where the person beside her simply did what needed doing. She closed the notebook. She put it back in her pocket against her ribs where it lived. She got up to make coffee for when he came back in. Outside, far down the mountain in the settlement at Harlan's Crossing, Amos Baylor sat in his workshop and did not mend the harness. He sat on his stool and looked at the wall. He had been looking at the wall for a long time. On the shelf above the work table in the place where he kept the things he returned to, there was a small photograph in a tin frame. It showed 4 people, a man and a woman and a teenage boy and a small girl of perhaps 6, sitting on a bench in the sunlight of a summer long past, squinting a little against the light, the way people squint in old photographs, because the light then was slower than it is now. The small girl was laughing at something outside the frame. Her mouth was open and her eyes were bright, and her whole small body was tilted toward whatever had made her laugh, the way children tilt toward joy before they learn that joy is sometimes expensive. Amos looked at the photograph. He looked at the wall. He sat with the harness in his hands for a very long time and did not mend it. The letter from Nora came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February, brought up the mountain by the post rider who had to break trail through 2 feet of new snow to reach the junction box, and who left it there without comment because that was the nature of the work, and he had long since stopped being surprised by what people needed to say to each other across difficult terrain. Silas brought it in with the cold still on it, the paper stiff at the edges from the temperature, and set it on the table in front of Ruth without remark. She looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. It was heavier than the previous letters, thicker. The address on the front was written in Nora's cramped, careful hand, but with more pressure than usual. The letters pressed deeper into the paper, the way you write when you are trying to make something permanent. Ruth opened it at the table while Silas poured his morning coffee and stood at the window looking at the snow. Inside the outer fold were 2 things. The first was a letter from Nora 3 pages long, which was longer than anything Nora had written before. The second was a separate sheaf of papers, 7 sheets of varying sizes and qualities, each covered in different handwriting, each beginning with a date and a name, and the words I attest to the following. Ruth read Nora's letter first. Nora wrote, "I want to tell you how this happened so you understand what it cost and what it did not cost, because I think the difference matters to you and it matters to me to be accurate about it. I went to 6 families first. I explained what I believed to be true and what I needed from them, and I told them what I thought it was for. 3 of them showed me the door before I finished speaking. One of them, Brother Lapp, told me to go home and pray for discernment and not to speak of this again. One of them listened to everything and then said she needed to think. One of them, old widow Hartman, sat me down and gave me coffee and told me things I did not know, things she had been carrying for 9 years without anyone to carry them to. Nora wrote, I went back to the 3 who had closed their doors. 2 of them still said no. The third one, Jacob Graber's father, changed his mind overnight. He came to my door in the morning and sat at my table and wrote 2 pages without stopping, and then folded them and gave them to me and left without saying anything more than, Tell Ruth, I am sorry, it took me this long. Nora wrote, I went back to the woman who needed to think. She had thought. She wrote the longest account of all of them. I do not know everything she put in it because she sealed it before she gave it to me and asked me to send it sealed, so I have done that. Whatever is in it, she felt strongly enough about to write it down and seal it and trust it to the post, and that is her decision, and I am honoring it. Nora wrote, I do not know if this is enough for what you need. I do not know enough about courts and judges to know what enough looks like, but I know that 7 people in this community chose to say something they could have kept saying nothing about, and that seems to me like it matters regardless of what a court does with it. She paused in the writing, or Ruth imagined her pausing, and then wrote, I should have been one of them 11 years ago. I know that. I am being one of them now. I cannot do anything about the order except keep going in the right direction. Ruth set the letter down. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up the sheaf of 7 attestations and began to read them one by one. Silas did not ask. He finished his coffee and went out to the barn and came back an hour later and started on the breakfast, and she was still reading slowly, going back over certain passages, and he did not interrupt her. When she set the last page down, she sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the middle distance, and she said nothing for a while. Silas put a plate in front of her. She looked at it. She said Nora spoke to 9 people. 7 of them wrote something down. She paused. She said, Among other things, there is an account from a woman who was present at 2 separate meetings between Amos and a man whose description matches Proctor. One in the autumn of 1877 and one in the spring of 1878. She heard financial figures discussed. She heard the word influence and the word cooperation. She writes that she did not know at the time what it referred to, and that she has known for at least 6 years and has told no one. Silas sat down across from her. He said, Why did she stay silent? Ruth said, Because Amos is the man who buried her husband. Because he sat with her through 2 miscarriages and 3 difficult winters, and because the community he leads is the only world she has ever known. She looked at Silas. Because the truth about someone you depend on is sometimes the most expensive truth there is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you want to do? She said, I want to take this and my notebook to Marshall Tanner. He said, When? She said, As soon as the roads will hold. He nodded. He picked up his fork. He said, Eat something first. She looked at the plate. She picked up her fork. She ate. They did not get to Tanner immediately because the roads did not cooperate, which was the nature of Montana February, which does not organize itself around human intentions. A storm came down from the north on the Saturday after the letters arrived and stayed for 4 days, piling snow against the cabin walls to window height on the north side and reducing visibility to the length of the porch for most of those days. Silas and Ruth moved through the enforced proximity of storm weather with the ease of people who have been learning each other's rhythms for 2 months and have mostly gotten them sorted. She baked bread when the storm was too loud for reading. He sharpened tools when the storm was too loud for conversation. They ate together and sat by the fire together and moved around each other in the kitchen with the unconscious coordination of 2 people who have been paying attention to where the other person is without making a project of it. On the second night of the storm, when the wind was at its highest and the cabin walls were doing what thick timber walls do in those conditions, which is absorb and hold and not give, Silas said from his chair by the fire, "I want to tell you something about why I came to Harlan's Crossing." Ruth set her mending down. He said, "It was not accidental. I knew Proctor had been working the settlements along that corridor for years. I had been watching him since 1885, since the trial." He turned his glass in his hands. "I knew he was going to come back to my land eventually, not because of anything specific, but because that is how men like Proctor work. They come back. They wait, and they come back, and they try a different angle." He looked at the fire. "I wanted to know what angle he had chosen before he came. So I started paying attention to the communities along the road, and I started hearing things about Harlan's Crossing that suggested the angle was going to involve someone inside the community rather than a direct approach to me." Ruth said Amos. Silas said, "I did not know it was Amos specifically. I only knew there was someone." He paused. He said, "I want to be honest with you about something, Ruth. When I came to Harlan's Crossing that morning and heard the meeting through the wall and then saw you at the fence line, I did not come to the settlement that day planning to get married." He said it directly looking at her. "The idea of it came to me when I saw you and heard what they had done and understood what your situation was." He paused again. "I want you to know that those two things, the situation with Proctor and the fact of you, have been separate in my mind since the first hour. I am not using you for anything other than what I said I was using you for, which is a wife who can manage a Montana winter." He looked at her steadily. "But I think you should know there was a reason I was in that place at that time that was not entirely coincidence." Ruth looked at him for a moment. The fire between them made its small sounds. The storm worked at the walls. She said, "I know." He said, "You know." She said, "I have been thinking about it since January. A man who comes to a settlement he does not belong to and fixes a fence post no one asked him to fix is a man who is paying close attention to something." She looked at him. "I could not decide for a while whether that troubled me," he said. "And now," she said, "you told me, without being asked, without being caught. That matters more to me than the reason you were there." She picked her mending back up. She said, "Silas, I have a notebook full of things I wrote down because something felt wrong, and I could not name it. I am not a woman who ignores what she notices. I had noticed." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You are not what I expected." She said, "What did you expect?" He said, "I do not know exactly. Someone more frightened, perhaps. Someone with less of themselves already decided." She said, "I have been deciding things about myself for 30 years without anyone's help. I am fairly practiced at it by now." He said, "I can see that." The storm blew. The fire burned. Ruth mended a tear in the hem of her second dress, and Silas sat with his glass and his thoughts. And the sound of the wind was very large outside, and the cabin was very warm inside, and the distance between those two things felt in that hour like something deliberately built rather than accidentally achieved. The roads opened in the third week of February. Not well and not fully, but enough. Silas hitched the horses on a Monday morning when the sky was clear, and the temperature had climbed to something that merely required a heavy coat rather than everything you owned, and they drove down the mountain to the town of Garfield, which was the nearest settlement with a marshal's office. A 12-mile drive on roads that were passable in the way that passable in winter means something different from passable in any other season. Ruth carried the notebook inside her coat against her ribs. The sheaf of 7 attestations was in the saddlebag behind the seat, wrapped in oilcloth against the cold. They did not talk much on the drive. There was not much that needed saying that had not been said in the long evenings of the storm. Ruth watched the country go by on either side, the white fields and the dark tree lines and the occasional distant ranch house with its smoke and its outbuildings and its sense of isolated self-sufficiency that she understood now in a way she had not fully understood before she had spent 2 months on a mountain with one other person and a woodpile. The marshal's office in Garfield was a single room attached to the side of the land office, heated by a small iron stove that was doing its best against the cold. Marshal George Tanner was a man of 52, with the look of someone who had spent his career watching people decide to do things they would later regret, and had developed a professional patience with human decision-making as a result. He was not a man who showed surprise easily. He showed something close to it when Ruth sat down across from his desk and set the notebook between them and began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She was precise, and she was organized, which she had been all her life, and which served her well, now moving through the events in the order they had occurred, providing dates where she had them, and honest estimates where she did not, distinguishing between what she had witnessed directly and what she had concluded from what she had witnessed. She was careful about that distinction. She had learned early that the difference between what you know and what you believe you know is the most important line there is, and she did not cross it. Tanner asked questions. They were good questions, the questions of a man who was genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply cataloging information, and she answered them with the same precision she had brought to the initial account. When she was done, Tanner sat back in his chair and looked at the notebook open on the desk before him, and then at her hands resting flat and still on the table, and then at the sheaf of 7 attestations she had laid beside the notebook. He was quiet for a moment longer than necessary, which told her he was deciding something rather than simply taking time. He said, "I should tell you that I have already received a communication regarding this matter from within the Harlan's Crossing community. I am not at liberty to say more than that at this stage, but you are not the first person to bring this direction to my attention." He picked up the attestations and read through them one by one. He took his time. She let him. When he set them down, he said, "There are 7 people in that community willing to repeat this before a judge." She said, "According to the woman who collected them?" "Yes." She said it plainly. "She does not make claims she cannot support." Tanner said, "This woman." He glanced at his notes. "Nora Graber." Ruth said, "Yes." He said, "And Elder Amos Byler. Is he willing to speak to any of this?" Ruth said, "I do not know." She paused. She said, "I believe he is carrying something that has been very heavy for a very long time. I believe he is not an evil man, but a man who made a bad decision and has been trying to live inside it ever since." She said, "I do not know what he will do when he is asked directly." Tanner said, "Someone will need to ask him directly." She said, "I know." Tanner looked at her for a moment. He said, "Mrs. Duff, you understand that if we move forward with this, Proctor's lawyers will challenge everything you have brought me today. They will challenge the age of the evidence. They will challenge your credibility. They will challenge your motives." She said, "I expect so." He said, "It will not be comfortable." She said, "Marshal Tanner, I have spent 30 years being managed by the discomfort of other people. My own does not concern me overmuch." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was its neighbor. He looked back at the notebook. He said, "I'm going to need to take this for the present. You will get it back." She said, "I know." She pushed it across the desk. She kept her hand on it for one moment, feeling the worn cover under her palm. The smooth spine, 11 years of carrying it and reading it and not understanding it, and now understanding it completely. Then she lifted her hand. Tanner took the notebook. He set it on his side of the desk and placed the attestations on top of it and put his hand flat over the stack. He said, "I will be in contact with you within the week." He said, "In the meantime, do not discuss this with anyone beyond your husband." She said, "There is one other person I need to speak to." He looked at her. She said, "My uncle." He considered this. Then he said, "That is your business. But be careful about what you say and how you say it." She stood up. She said, "Marshal, I have been careful about what I say and how I say it for 30 years. I think I can manage a conversation with an old man." She did not go to Amos directly. She wrote to him first because that was the right thing, because arriving at a man's door with the weight of what she was carrying required giving him some preparation, and because she had decided on the long drive down from the mountain that she was not going to be cruel about this, not because Amos deserved protection from it, but because cruelty was not something she was willing to practice, regardless of what it was aimed at. She wrote to him from Garfield from the small writing desk at the rooming house where she and Silas stayed the night before driving back up the mountain. She wrote 3 sentences. She wrote, Uncle Amos. I have spoken with Marshal Tanner in Garfield. I need to speak with you, and I believe you need to speak with me. She sent it with the Morning Post. Then she and Silas drove back up the mountain and waited. His reply came in 4 days. It was shorter than her letter. It said, I know. Come when you are ready. I will be here. She read it twice. She folded it. She said nothing to Silas about what it said, only that Amos had replied and that she would need to go down to the settlement. Silas said, I will drive you. She said, I need to go alone. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, All right. She said, It is not a thing that requires witnesses. He said, I understand. She said, Thank you. He picked up his coffee. He said, Take the gray mare. She is steadier on the ice than the roan. She took the gray mare. The settlement at Heartland's Crossing looked smaller than she remembered it, which was probably not true in any measurable way, but was true in the way that places always look smaller when you have been somewhere else for a while, when your sense of what space means has been recalibrated by 2 months on a mountain with a bigger sky. She rode in on a Tuesday morning when the settlement was in the middle of its daily work, and the people were in the fields and the barns and the workshops. A few people looked up when she rode past. A few did not. She did not stop. She rode to the back of the settlement where Amos's house and workshop sat at the edge of the property where the cultivated ground gave way to the scrub and the tree line. She tied the gray mare at the post and knocked. He opened the door before she finished knocking. He had been waiting, which she had known he would be. He looked at her for a moment, standing in his doorway, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He looked old. He had always looked younger than his age, and now he did not. He looked like a man who had aged several years in the 2 months since she had last seen him, which she understood was not because of time, but because of what he had been carrying inside the time. He stepped back from the door. He said, Come in, Ruth. She came in. The house was the same as it had always been, plain and clean and slightly cold, the way houses get when only one person lives in them, and that person does not heat rooms they are not using. He led her to the kitchen, which was the warmest room, and there was coffee already made and 2 cups already set, which told her he had been preparing for this for days. She sat. He sat across from her. He poured the coffee. He set the pot down. He wrapped his hands around his cup and looked at it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear the settlement going about its work, the particular sounds of people and animals, and the daily operation of a life organized around labor and season and the shared obligations of community. Amos said, I went to Tanner myself 3 days ago. Ruth looked at him. He said, I did not know you had already been there. I went because I had decided it was time. He looked up at her. Whatever it costs me. I had decided it was time. She said, What did you tell him? He said, Everything. He paused. All of it, from 1877. He paused again. The money, what Proctor wanted, what I agreed to. He said it without looking away from her face, which she understood cost him something. He said, I told him about Jacob Mast, about the arrangement, about your land and why Proctor wanted it, and what he offered me in exchange for allowing it to happen. Ruth sat with this for a moment. She said, Why now? He said, Because I have been saying I want to tell you something for 2 months, and I have not finished saying it once. He set his cup down. He said, I'm going to finish it now. He looked at her steadily. When Proctor came to me in 1877, I told myself I was protecting the community. I told myself that one girl's unhappiness was a small price for the stability of everything we had built here. I told myself the Lord would provide for you some other way. He paused. He said I knew when I said it that it was not entirely true. I knew there was money in the reasoning that had nothing to do with the Lord. I knew that I was choosing the easier thing and calling it the holy thing, which is a habit that men in positions of authority develop so gradually they sometimes do not notice it happening. He looked at his hands. He said I noticed. I told myself I would make it right eventually, that there would be a moment when I could repair what I had done without destroying what I had protected. He said, that moment did not come because I did not make it come. I kept waiting for it to arrive on its own because that was easier than making it arrive. Ruth looked at him. She looked at the lines in his face and the white of his hair and the way he sat on his stool with his shoulders slightly forward, the posture of a man who had been bending toward hard work his whole life and had finally run out of ways to straighten up completely. She said, "Why did you vote to send me away?" he said. "Because Proctor came to me again in November. He told me you were a liability, that you knew too much, even if you did not know you knew it. He said if you stayed in the settlement, eventually someone would ask the right questions, and eventually you would have the answers. He said the safest thing for everyone was for you to go somewhere else." Ruth said, "He was afraid of my notebook." Amos looked at her. He said, "He was afraid of you. The notebook is just paper." He paused. "He has always been more afraid of the person than the evidence." She looked at the table between them, at the 2 coffee cups and the old familiar kitchen and the sound of the settlement outside. She said, "Uncle Amos, when I was 6 years old, you put me on your shoulders and ran through the wheat field because I was afraid of the Heartland bull, and you wanted me to see how small it looked from up high." He looked at her. She said, "I have not forgotten that. I am not going to forget it." He said nothing. Something moved in his face that was large and slow and complicated the way things move in people who have been holding them still for a very long time. She said, "What you did was wrong, and you knew it was wrong when you did it, and you have known it every day since, and you are going to have to live with that for the rest of your life." She said it plainly. She did not say it harshly. Plain and harsh are different instruments, and she had always known the difference. She said, "But you went to Tanner. You did not wait for the court to come to you. You went yourself." She paused. She said, "That is not nothing, Uncle." He looked at his hands. He nodded once, slowly, the way old men nod when they have received something they know they do not entirely deserve and are trying to hold it carefully. She picked up her coffee cup. She drank. She set it down. Outside, the settlement went about its work. Inside, the kitchen held its warmth and its quiet, and the particular weight of 2 people who have been through something together and are only now beginning to understand what they have come out into on the other side. They sat together for another hour. They did not say everything. Some things would take longer than 1 hour in a kitchen in February. But they said enough. Enough to open the door that she had told him was there. Enough to suggest that walking through it was possible if slow, if imperfect, if requiring patience from both of them in quantities that would need to be renewable. When she stood to go, Amos stood too. He went to the shelf above the work table and took down something small wrapped in a piece of cloth. He held it out to her. She unwrapped it. It was a photograph in a tin frame. 4 people on a bench in summer sunlight. A man and a woman and a teenage boy and a small girl laughing at something outside the frame, her whole body tilted toward whatever had made her laugh. She looked at the small girl's face for a long moment. She wrapped the photograph back in the cloth and held it in both hands. She said, "Thank you." He said, "It belongs with you." She put on her coat. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame the way she had seen Silas stop, and she said without turning around Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock. Tanner will want statements from both of us in the same session. There was a pause. Then Amos said, "I will be there." She walked out into the February cold and untied the gray mare and rode back up the mountain with the photograph pressed against her ribs on one side and the empty place where the notebook had been on the other. And the cold air came off the peaks and worked through her coat, and she let it, because the cold at least was honest about what it was. And she had always respected honesty more than comfort. The hearing in Garfield on the following Wednesday was not a trial. Tanner was careful to explain this at the outset. It was a preliminary examination, a formal collection of testimony that would be evaluated by the territorial judge who came through Garfield every 6 weeks, and on the basis of that evaluation, a determination would be made about whether the matter warranted further proceedings. This was the language of the process. Ruth had expected the language and was not confused by it. What she had not expected was the size of the room when they arrived. She had thought it would be Tanner and his desk, and perhaps a clerk. Instead, Proctor's lawyers were already there when she and Silas arrived. 2 men from Helena in wool coats that cost more than the average Montana rancher earned in 3 months, accompanied by a young man whose job appeared to be carrying their documents and looking competent, which he achieved to varying degrees. They looked at Ruth when she came in. She looked back at them. Neither party communicated anything that was not necessary. Proctor himself was not present. She had wondered if he would be. She understood when she saw his lawyers and understood the calculation they represented that a man like Proctor did not attend preliminary hearings in Garfield. He sent representations of his interests and waited in Helena for news of how those interests had fared. Amos came in 10 minutes after Ruth and Silas. He was alone. He sat down at the end of the row of chairs along the wall without speaking to anyone, and he held his hat in his hands, and he looked at the floor, and he did not look like the man who had stood in the front of the meeting house every Sunday morning for 20 years telling people what the Lord required of them. He looked like a man who was waiting to say something that needed to be said and had decided finally and completely to say it. Tanner ran the session with the economy of a man who respects everyone's time, including his own. He took Ruth's testimony first. She spoke for 30 minutes, precisely moving through the evidence in the order she had organized it, presenting the notebook and the attestations as she referenced them, answering Proctor's lawyers when they questioned her with the same patience and precision she had brought to everything else. The lawyers were good. They were practiced at the particular art of making evidence seem less certain than it is of introducing the word coincidence into discussions of pattern, of suggesting that a woman who had spent 11 years carrying a document without understanding it might not be the most reliable interpreter of what it contained. They did this professionally and without visible malice, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about them, the quality of a machine performing a function for which it has been precisely engineered. Ruth answered every question. She did not get flustered. She did not get sharp. She understood that the most effective thing she could do in the face of practiced skepticism was to remain exactly what she was, which was a woman who had written down what she heard because she did not understand it and had understood it finally, and was telling the truth about both the hearing and the understanding without embellishment or apology. When she was done, Tanner called Amos. Amos stood up. He walked to the chair at the front of the room, and he sat down, and he held his hat in his lap, and he looked at Tanner, and then he looked at Ruth once briefly, and then he looked back at Tanner. He spoke for 25 minutes. He was not organized the way Ruth was organized. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is saying something he has rehearsed in his own mind many times, but has never said aloud, with the occasional hesitation of a person finding that the spoken version of a thing is slightly different from the version that lived inside him. But he was clear. He was specific. He gave dates and figures and the nature of what had been said between himself and Proctor in 1877 and again in 1885 and again in November of 1888, and he made no effort to soften his own role in any of it, which Tanner noted and which the lawyers, Ruth observed, had not anticipated. Proctor's lawyers questioned him for 15 minutes. He answered everything. When it was over, Tanner collected all the documents and thanked everyone for their time and said he would be submitting everything to the territorial judge with a recommendation that the matter be examined at a formal hearing at the earliest opportunity. Proctor's senior lawyer said something about the age of the primary evidence and the reliability of recovered memory that was technically about the law, but had a quality that was about something else. tanner listened to it and said he understood and thanked him for his perspective and turned back to his desk. Ruth and Silas walked out of the building into the February cold. Amos came out behind them. The three of them stood on the boardwalk in front of the land office for a moment without speaking. Then Amos said, "I want to know." He said it to the general air in front of him, not to either of them specifically. He said, "The land, your mother's land, on the south side of the creek." He said, "I want you to know that I am going to do what I can to ensure it returns to you, whatever that requires." He said, "It should never have left your family." Ruth looked at him. She thought about the land she had plowed since she was 12 years old. The apple tree, the south-facing garden, the creek she had fished in with her father on summer mornings before the work started. She said, "We will see what the judge says first." He nodded. He looked at his hat. He said, "I will be at the full hearing when it is called, whatever that costs." She said, "I know, Uncle." She paused. She said, "Wednesday mornings at 9 o'clock. The meeting house. You are still the elder of that community, and they still need you in it." He looked at her, then really looked the way he had looked at her when she was a child, and had said something that surprised him with its accuracy, with the expression of a man encountering a truth he had not expected from the direction it came from. She said, "What you built there matters to a lot of people. What you did wrong does not undo that." She said it without comfort and without cruelty, only with the plain accuracy she had always preferred to either. She said, "You have to hold both of those things at the same time. That is what it costs." She turned and walked to where Silas was waiting with the wagon. He helped her up onto the seat. He came around and took the reins. The horses started forward. The wheels of the wagon found the packed snow of the Garfield Main Street, and they moved north toward the road that would take them up the mountain. After a while, Silas said, "You all right?" She said, "Yes." He said, "He did well in there." She said, "He did what needed doing." She looked at the road ahead, at the white country opening up in front of them, the dark pines and the distant mountains and the sky that was doing what Montana sky does in February when the weather is clear, which is being larger than you remember it being larger than any enclosure can prepare you for. She said, "That is all any of us can do." The wagon rolled on. The cold was real and clean, and the horses were steady, and the road was passable, and the mountains ahead were the same mountains. They had always been indifferent to everything that happened at their feet, but present for all of it, holding their snow and their silence and their distance. The way they had always held them, the way they would go on holding them long after all of this had become simply the past. Ruth held the photograph in her coat pocket and felt the empty place where the notebook had been, and looked at the mountains, and thought about 7 people who had written things down because someone had asked them to. She thought about an old man standing up in a chair in a small room and saying the difficult true thing without flinching. She thought about a 14-year-old boy sitting at a kitchen table reading past the hard words. She thought about what Silas had said on the first night she had stayed in the cabin when he had come downstairs and found her reading in the firelight and had not asked her to put the book away. He had simply sat with her. He had simply been there. That was not a small thing. She had been telling herself that for 2 months, and she was becoming more certain of it with each telling. The wagon moved north through the cold afternoon, and the mountains came closer, and the road narrowed into the pines, and the world grew quieter around them. And Ruth Byler Duff, who had spent 30 years being told in one way and another that she was more than the world could comfortably accommodate, sat in the wagon seat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and looked toward the high country that was her home now, and felt with a clarity that was not dramatic but was very certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The territorial judge came through Garfield on the first Thursday of April. His name was Aldous Cray, and he was 64 years old, and he had been riding the circuit through eastern Montana Territory for 11 years, which meant he had seen most of what people did to each other over land and money, and the particular desperation that comes from living in a place that does not forgive mistakes. He was not a sentimental man. He was not an easy man, But he was a careful one, which Ruth had decided was the quality that mattered most in a person who held authority over other people's lives. The formal hearing lasted 2 days. Ruth testified again. She was more practiced now than she had been in February. Not in the way of a person who has rehearsed a performance, but in the way of a person who has told the truth enough times that the truth has worn itself smooth, that the telling of it has become simply the thing it is, rather than something that requires effort. She answered every question. She did not embellish. She did not retreat. When Proctor's lead lawyer suggested that a woman who had carried a document for 11 years without understanding it was perhaps not the most reliable interpreter of its significance, she said, "I did not carry it because I understood it. I carried it because I did not. When I understood it, I brought it here." That is what you do with evidence. You bring it to the people whose job it is to evaluate it. Judge Cray wrote something in his ledger when she said that. Amos testified for 40 minutes. He was slower than he had been in February, more deliberate, as though he had spent the intervening weeks deciding exactly how to say each thing, and was now following that decision carefully. He gave the year, and the amount, and the nature of what had been agreed to. He described the 2 meetings with Proctor in 1877 and 1878 with the specificity of a man who has replayed those meetings in his mind many thousands of times and knows every detail, because guilt has a way of preserving what it touches. He described the arrangement regarding Jacob Mast. He described November of 1888 and Proctor's second approach and what had been said about Ruth and why she needed to be removed from the settlement before she became a problem. He did not look at Ruth while he testified. He looked at the judge. When he was done, Proctor's lawyers questioned him for 30 minutes. He answered everything. He did not soften anything. He did not shift anything to make himself look better than he was. Ruth watched him from her chair along the wall and thought about a man who had made a wrong choice and lived inside it for 11 years and had finally decided that living inside it was no longer something he was willing to do. The 7 attestations were entered into the record. Nora's name was read aloud. Ruth heard it and looked at her hands in her lap and thought about a woman who had knocked on doors she had never knocked on before and had not stopped when the first 3 closed in her face. On the second afternoon, Judge Cray delivered his ruling. Silas Duff's claim to the land he had farmed and maintained for 9 years was confirmed legally valid under the Homestead Act. The competing claim filed by Proctor's lawyers was dismissed as procedurally deficient and substantively without merit. The court further found sufficient evidence of a pattern of corrupt influence across multiple land transactions in the territory to warrant referral to the federal prosecutor's office in Helena for further investigation. Dean Proctor was not in the room. He had sent his lawyers and his documents and his careful legal arguments, and none of them had been enough because Ruth had been writing things down since she was 19 years old, and Amos Beeler had finally finished the sentence he had been trying to say for 11 years. Ruth sat in her chair along the wall and listened to Judge Cray read the ruling in his careful, measured voice, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. The feeling of a weight being put down in the right place after being carried a very long way. Silas was sitting 2 chairs down from her. When the judge finished speaking and the room began to move again, Silas looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said that words were the right instrument for. They walked out of the hearing room into the April afternoon together, into air that was cold, but not the deep cold of winter, a cold that had begun to negotiate with the season coming behind it. The main street of Garfield was muddy with snowmelt, and the sky was the particular pale blue of early spring, tentative and wide. Amos was waiting on the boardwalk outside. He had his hat in his hands, and he was looking at the street, and he did not immediately look up when they came out. When he did, he looked at Ruth first, then at Silas, then back at Ruth. He said, "The land." I spoke with the judge's clerk before the session. He said the referral to the federal prosecutor will include review of all land transactions Proctor was involved in through community intermediaries. He paused. They will look at your family's parcel, the south side of the creek. Ruth said, I know. He said I will cooperate with everything they ask, whatever I can do to see it return to you. She looked at him, standing there on the boardwalk, with his hat in his hands and his coat too large for him. The way coats get too large for men when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the weight of it has worked on them from the inside. She thought about the photograph in the tin frame, the small girl laughing at something outside the frame, the whole small body tilted toward joy. She said, Uncle Amos, come to dinner on Sunday. He looked at her. She said, the cabin is 7 miles. The road is better now that the snow is going. She said it the way she said most things plainly, without more warmth than she had, and without less. Come to dinner. We will eat, and we will talk about ordinary things, and we will begin the work of figuring out what we are to each other from here. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I will bring something. What do you need? She said. Flour. We are running low on flour. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He said, Sunday. She said, Sunday. He walked away down the boardwalk toward where he had tied his horse. She watched him go. She did not call after him. There was nothing to call. Sunday was enough. Flour was enough. The door was open, and that was what mattered, not the speed at which a person walked through it. Silas put his hand briefly at the small of her back, the same gesture he had made on the morning they left the settlement present and without drama. She said, Ready. He said, the horses are at the end of the street. They walked. Nora came up the mountain 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning when the snow had retreated to the highest elevations and the lower slopes were showing the first pale green of the season, tentative as everything is in Montana in April, as though the land is not quite ready to commit to the idea of warmth but is willing to consider it. She came alone. Her husband had stayed home with the children. She rode up on a bay mare she had borrowed from her father-in-law, and she tied the horse at the porch post and stood for a moment looking at the cabin before she knocked the way you look at a place when you are not sure of the reception that waits inside it. Ruth opened the door before she knocked. She had seen her coming up the road through the south window. They looked at each other in the doorway. Nora looked the way people look when they have been preparing for a thing for a long time and have now arrived at the moment of it and are not sure whether the preparation was enough. Her face was older than Ruth remembered. Not in years, but in the way faces age when a person has spent time looking at themselves honestly. Ruth stepped back from the door. She said, Come in. There is coffee. Nora came in. She looked around the cabin the way people look at a place they have heard about and are now seeing for the first time, taking in the hearth and the 2 chairs and the shelves and the south window. She looked at the place on the wall where the tack cloth hung in the square where the mirror had been, and she did not ask about it, which told Ruth something about what kind of attention Nora was capable of when she chose to use it. They sat at the table. Ruth poured the coffee. Outside, the spring was doing its slow, uncertain work on the hillside, and the sound of water moving in the creek below the cabin came up through the open window the first time the window had been opened since December. Nora wrapped her hands around her cup. She said I had a speech prepared. She said it without preamble. She looked at the table. I wrote it out 3 times on paper and practiced it in the kitchen in the mornings when the children were still asleep. She looked up at Ruth. I have forgotten all of it. Ruth said, That is probably for the best. Nora made a sound that was almost a laugh. She said I stood in that meeting house 11 years ago. She stopped. She said I have thought about what I would say to you about that day more times than I can count. And every version of it starts with me trying to explain why I did not speak, and ends with me understanding that there is no explanation that is not just another word for cowardice. She looked at her hands. So, I am not going to explain. I am just going to say that I knew it was wrong when it happened, and I said nothing, and I have carried that, and I am tired of carrying it. Ruth was quiet for a moment. The creek ran below the window. A bird called from somewhere in the pines, the first she had heard in months. She said, Nora, You knocked on 9 doors. 3 of them closed in your face, and you went back. She said it without particular warmth, but without coldness, either the way she said true things that were also important. That required something I am not sure I could have done in your position. She paused. I am not saying it cancels 11 years. I am saying it is real, and I see it. Nora looked at her. Her eyes were bright. She did not cry. She had the look of a woman who had decided not to cry and was managing it, which Ruth respected more than easy tears. Nora said, Can we just... She stopped. Can we start from here? Not pretend the other thing did not happen, but start from here as well. Ruth picked up her coffee cup. She said, That is what I am doing. Nora picked up hers. They drank. Outside, the spring moved through the pines, and the creek ran clear over the stones below, and the morning worked its way toward noon, with the particular unhurried quality of April mornings in the high country, as though the season understands that it has been waited for and intends to arrive on its own terms. They talked for 3 hours, not about the court or Proctor or Amos or any of the machinery of the winter just past, about Nora's youngest child who had started walking and could not be trusted near the well, about the settlement's plan to extend the south fence, about a book Ruth had been reading and what she thought of it, about the particular difficulty of making good bread at altitude which Ruth had solved and Nora had not, about small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that 2 women talk about when they are feeling their way back toward each other, and finding that the ground, though changed, is still navigable. When Nora left in the early afternoon, she stopped at the porch and turned around. She said, Ruth. You look. She paused, searching. She said, You look like yourself, like you have room to be yourself. Ruth thought about that. She said, I think that is the right way to put it. Nora rode away down the mountain road. Ruth stood on the porch and watched her go, and then went back inside because there was bread that needed checking and dinner that needed starting, and Silas would be back from the north fence line within the hour. She went inside. She checked the bread. She started the dinner. The creek ran below the window, and the air through the open window smelled of pine and wet earth, and the particular green smell of things beginning. And she stood at the stove and breathed it in, and did not try to name what she was feeling, because some things are better left unnamed, kept whole, rather than broken into words. Henry Schrock arrived on a Saturday in late April without warning, which was entirely in character for a 14-year-old boy who had not yet learned that arrivals require preparation. He came on foot, which meant he had walked the 7 miles from the settlement up the mountain road, which meant he had left at first light, which meant the thing he was coming for had felt urgent enough to start before the sun was fully up. Ruth was in the garden when she heard him on the road. The south-facing garden was showing its first growth, the herbs she had planted 6 weeks ago now, an inch above the soil, tentative and precise. She straightened up and shielded her eyes and saw him coming around the last bend in the road, with his coat open and his cap pushed back, and the particular determined walk of a boy who has been moving for a long time and has decided not to think about how much further it is. She waited. He came into the clearing and stopped and looked at her, and then looked at the cabin, and then looked at the garden, and said, You planted already. She said, 3 weeks ago. The south slope holds warmth early. He said, I did not know that. She said, Now you do. She looked at him. 7 miles is a long walk for a Saturday morning. He looked at the ground, the way he had always looked at the ground when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. He said, I wanted to see that you were all right. He paused. And I wanted to ask. He stopped. She waited. He said, Mr. Duff, is he? He looked at the barn where Silas could be heard working on something with a consistent and purposeful sound. He said, Is he a good man? Ruth looked at the boy who had run alongside a moving wagon and held her hand for 1 real second before letting go, who had sat at her kitchen table 4 evenings a week, learning to read words he did not know because she had believed it was worth the effort, who was standing now in the spring mud of her garden, asking whether the man she had married was a good man. She said, "Come and meet him yourself." She called toward the barn. "Silas?" The working sound stopped. Silas appeared in the barn doorway, large and unhurried, with wood shavings on his coat and the calm expression of a man who is not surprised by much. She said, "This is Henry Schrock. He has walked 7 miles this morning to check on things." Silas looked at the boy. He said, "7 miles?" Henry said, "Yes, sir." Silas said, "Did you eat before you left?" Henry said, "No, sir." Silas said, "Come inside then." He turned back into the barn. "Let me finish this joint and I will make eggs." He disappeared back inside. The working sound resumed. Henry looked at Ruth. She said, "He makes good eggs." She went back to the garden. "Sit on the porch if you want, or you can help me with the planting." Henry came to the garden. He crouched down and looked at the small, precise rows of emerging green. He said, "What are these ones?" She said, "Thyme. These are sage. These will be the kitchen herbs." She handed him the small trowel. "You can do the next row, 6 inches apart, no deeper than the first joint of your finger." He took the trowel. He measured with his finger. He planted. They worked in the garden in the spring morning, and Silas came out after a while and watched Henry planting for a moment, and then went to the woodpile and began splitting the smaller pieces for kindling, not because it needed doing immediately, but because it was the kind of work that could be done near people you were getting a sense of, and Silas had always understood that getting a sense of someone required proximity without pressure. After a while, Silas said to Henry without looking up from the wood, "You split before," Henry said. "Some." Silas said, "Come here a minute." Henry went. Silas showed him the angle of the wrist, the way the weight of the axe does most of the work, if you let it the particular quality of attention you need to split cleanly instead of glancing. Henry tried. The first piece went sideways, the second split clean. He looked up at Silas. Silas said, "There you go." They split wood together for 20 minutes, Silas correcting the grip once more, otherwise silent, while Ruth finished the row of thyme and started the sage. At noon, they went inside, and Silas made eggs with salt pork and the last of the winter potatoes, and they sat at the table together, 3 of them in the cabin that had been built for one, and had gradually been making room for more. After they ate, Henry helped Ruth wash the dishes, and then stood at the south window and looked out at the garden and the slope below and the valley far down, where the settlement was too distant to see, but there, in the way that things you have always known are always there, even when they are out of sight. He said, "I finished the primer." Ruth said, "I know." She had received a letter from him 3 weeks before, 2 pages in the careful hand of a boy who had learned to write the way he had learned everything slowly and then all at once. She said, "There is another book on the shelf there, 3rd from the left." He went to the shelf. He found it. He looked at the spine. He said, "This one is harder." She said, "Yes, that is why it is next." He looked at the book for a moment. Then he said quietly, facing the shelf, "I want to ask you something." She waited. He turned around. He was trying to look older than 14, and not entirely succeeding, which was exactly right for a boy of 14 who was doing something that required more courage than most people his age had been called on to need. He said, "My mother has too many of us. There is not enough work for me there that is not already being done." He stopped. He said, "I am useful. I know I am useful. I work hard and I learn fast, and I—" He stopped again. Ruth looked at him. She looked at the boy who had run 7 miles up a mountain on a Saturday morning to check on someone he cared about and had not thought to eat first because caring about the person had seemed more urgent than eating. She said, "Silas." Silas was at the hearth adding wood. He looked over his shoulder. She said, "The room at the back of the barn, the one you said you were going to use for equipment storage." Silas looked at her. Then he looked at Henry. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was making a decision he had already mostly made. He said, "It needs a window." He said it to Henry. Henry said, "I can put in a window." He said it fast the way you say things when you have been hoping for a particular answer, and it has arrived, and you need to confirm it before it changes. He said I put in the window frame in the Graber barn 2 summers ago. I know how it is done. Silas said. All right. He turned back to the fire. We will talk to your mother. She needs to agree to it. Henry said. She will agree. He said it with the certainty of a boy who knows his mother loves him and also knows there are too many of them, and that one less means one more for the others. Ruth handed him the book from the shelf. She said, Take that. Start it on the way home. Come back Wednesday evening and we will talk through the first chapter. He took the book. He held it the way he held things that mattered, carefully aware of their weight. He said, Thank you, Miss Ruth. She said, Mrs. Duff. He said, Mrs. Duff. He tried the name. He nodded as though approving it. Then he put on his coat and his cap and went out into the April afternoon to walk 7 miles back down the mountain with a book in his coat pocket and the particular lightness of a person who has asked for a hard thing and received it. The letter from Agnes came on a Tuesday at the end of April, tucked between a seed catalog and a bill from the Garfield dry goods store. Ruth almost missed it. Agnes Raber had been in the settlement at Harlan's Crossing all her life, and intended to remain there all her death, which was a distinction she drew clearly and without apology. And she wrote letters the way she lived with the particular directness of a woman who had decided early that there was not enough time in a life to spend much of it on indirection. The letter said in Agnes's plain, straight hand, Ruth, I have been meaning to write for 2 months and have not because I could not decide what to say, and then I decided that was foolish and I should simply say it, and here I am saying it. The settlement is strange without you. Not sad exactly. Strange. Like a room where someone has moved the furniture and you keep walking into the space where the chair used to be. The letter said also, There is news I thought you might want to hear, though. I could not say why exactly, except that sometimes we need to hear things that we thought we needed to hear, in order to find out we did not need them after all. Jacob Mast left Helena 4 months ago. His wife left him last winter, I am told, and whatever the arrangement was that kept him comfortable there went with her. I heard he is in Billings now. I do not know what he does there. I do not particularly care. I imagine you do not either, but I thought you should have the chance to find that out for yourself. Ruth set the letter down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at the window. Outside, the April afternoon was doing what April afternoons do in the high country when the season has finally committed, which is filling the world with a light that is different from winter light, not brighter exactly, but more present, more willing to stay. She picked up the letter and read the paragraph about Jacob Mast again. She waited to feel something. She had spent 11 years assuming that the information would feel like something, that the name in the right context, the news of consequence, would produce some recognizable emotion, relief or satisfaction, or the particular feeling of a debt settled. She had imagined it many times, and in the imagining, it had always felt like something. It felt like nothing, not emptiness, not numbness, more like arriving at a place where you expected a wall, and finding that the wall had been quietly removed at some point when you were not looking, and the space behind it was just ordinary air, just the room continuing past where you had thought it ended. She folded the letter carefully. She would write back to Agnes, not today, but soon. Agnes deserved a real reply, the kind that required thought, and Ruth had learned enough about herself to know that thought needed time and the right quality of quiet. She put the letter in the pocket of her dress. She went outside. Silas was at the far end of the new fence line, the one he had been extending for 3 weeks, working with the slow, methodical patience of a man building something he intends to last. She could see him from the garden, a dark shape against the pale spring sky, moving along the line with the post driver and the wire. She stood in the garden and looked at the rows she had planted, and the green coming up out of the dark soil, and the mountains still holding their snow at the high elevations, and the valley below where the settlement sat in its plain, careful arrangement, and the sky above all of it, going from afternoon blue toward the particular gold of early evening. She placed her hand flat against the front of her dress, against the pocket where the letter was, and then she moved her hand lower to the place it had been going on its own for 3 weeks. The unconscious gesture of a woman who knows something and has not yet decided how to say it. She had been thinking about how to say it for 3 weeks. Not out of fear, not out of uncertainty about the answer. She knew the answer. She had known it for a while. She had been thinking about how to say it because she wanted to say it right, because the right thing deserved to be said in the right way. And she had not found the right way until this afternoon, with Agnes's letter in her pocket, and the garden around her, and the mountains beyond, and the man at the far end of the fence line who had come to a place he was not supposed to be, at a time he had not planned on, had found her there, and had stayed. She walked out of the garden and across the clearing and down the slope to the fence line. Silas heard her coming. He did not stop working, but his attention shifted in the way she had learned to read the slight change in the quality of his presence that meant he knew where she was. She came to the fence and stood beside him. He drove the last staple on the post he was working and straightened up and looked at her. She said, "I had a letter from Agnes today." He said, "Good news." She said, "Ordinary news." She looked at the fence line stretching away into the new green of the hillside. She said, "Silas." He waited. She said, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him directly, the way she had always looked at things she needed to see clearly. She said, "Not because I do not know the answer. I think I know the answer. But I want to ask you because I want you to tell me yourself." He set the post driver down. He gave her his full attention, which when Silas gave it, was a complete thing, not divided or directed elsewhere. She said, "Are you here because this is where you want to be? Not because of the land, or because of practicality, or because of any arrangement we made in December. Are you here because you want to be here?" He looked at her for a long moment. The hillside was quiet around them. The creek ran below. A hawk turned once in the wide, pale sky and then moved away to the south. He said, "I am here because this is the first place in 7 years that has felt like somewhere I am supposed to be." He said it without ornamentation. He said, "I am here because you are here." He paused. He said, "I stopped thinking of it as an arrangement about 6 weeks after you arrived." She said, "I know." "I stopped thinking of it that way at about the same time." He said, "Is there something you want to tell me?" She said yes. She told him. He was still for a moment, not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a man receiving something he had not known he was waiting for, and finding that his body understood it before his mind had finished catching up. He looked at her face, and then at his hands, and then back at her face. He said, "Ruth." She said, "I know it is early to be certain." "But I am certain." He said, "Are you?" She said, "Yes." He stood there in the spring afternoon with the fence line behind him, and the mountains above, and the valley below, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something too large and too quiet for a name, the expression of a man to whom something has been given that he had stopped believing would be given again. He reached out and took her hand. He held it the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping, not because it is fragile, but because it is not, and you are. After a while, he said, "Thomas would have been 12 this summer." She said, "I know." He said, "I think he would have liked this place." She said, "I think so too." They stood at the fence line in the late afternoon, and the spring moved through the high country around them, through the pines and the new grass and the creek running cold and clear from the snow melt above, and the sky held its light longer than it had in months, the way April sky does when it has finally made up its mind. By May, the apple sapling Amos had brought on his first Sunday visit was in the ground at the southeast corner of the garden in a spot Ruth had chosen because it caught the morning sun and was sheltered from the northwest wind by the cabin wall. Amos had carried it wrapped in burlap all the way up the mountain road on his horse, which was either devotion or stubbornness, and Ruth had decided it was probably both. Henry had put the window in the back room of the barn by the end of his first week, which was not a surprise to Ruth, and was a mild surprise to Silas, who had underestimated the precision of a 14-year-old boy who had been watching how things were built and repaired since he was old enough to stand next to someone doing it. The window faced east, In the mornings, the light came through it and fell across the small room in a rectangle that moved across the floor as the sun rose, and Henry had placed his few things in the cabin and his one book on the shelf above the bed and his coat on the peg behind the door. And he had looked at the room for a long moment the first morning and then gone out to start the chores because that was the kind of boy he was. On a Sunday morning in May, Ruth stood on the porch of the cabin and looked at the clearing and the garden and the barn and the mountains beyond and the valley below and the sky above all of it, open and pale and very large. Inside the cabin, she could hear Silas moving around the kitchen, the sound of the stove being stoked and the water pot being filled, and the particular unhurried sounds of a man making Sunday breakfast. Through the barn window, she could see the lamp Henry had lit a small rectangle of warm light in the gray of the early morning. Amos would come at noon. He came every Sunday now with flour or with some other thing they needed, or sometimes with nothing but himself, which was enough, which was the point. Nora had written again a longer letter this time, easy, in a way that early letters had not been. Ruth had started a reply the evening before and had found halfway through it that she was writing naturally without the careful calibration of how much to give and how much to withhold, and she had stopped and looked at what she had written and recognized the shape of something she had not had in a long time. She put her hand against the front of her dress. The child was not yet showing. Would not for another few weeks, the doctor in Garfield had said. But she knew. She had known for a month, and Silas had known for a month, and Henry did not know yet, and Amos did not know yet, and on this particular Sunday morning, that was exactly right, the knowing shared between the two of them, and no one else, private and warm and theirs. The sun came over the eastern ridge. It fell across the porch and across the garden and across the apple sapling in the corner of the garden, which had put out its first 3 leaves in the past week, small and bright and improbably green against the dark soil. An apple tree needed years before it bore fruit. That was not a problem. Ruth Byler. Duff had learned over the course of a long and often difficult life that the things worth having were almost always the things worth waiting for, and that patience was not the absence of desire, but its most honest expression. She stood on the porch in the May morning and looked at her land and her garden and her apple tree and listened to the sounds of the people inside and around her and felt the small beginning of the life she was carrying, and she did not try to hold any of it at arm's length or protect herself from the wanting of it. She simply let it be what it was, which was enough, which was everything.